And I think oftentimes in the gender space, we think a lot about allyship through the lens of, well, as a woman, you need a male ally. And although I do believe that male allies are important, I also know that intersectionality is really important and having intersectional allies. So women can be allies of other women. So the same way, a Tom in the meeting could say, "Hey, that was Brittany's idea. Brittany, did you have anything else to add to that?" Tiffany could do the same thing.
Hi, my name is Frank Schaeffer, and you are listening to and/or watching the podcast, which I do on a regular basis, called In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. And today, my guest is Brittany Cole, who does a lot of stuff, but we'll start with this. She's the author of Thrive Through It, a guide to redefine resilience. But the subtitle goes on to communicate with empathy, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like my books. The titles get so long on my books that I lose track of them. So Ernie's my producer Ernie is now laughing, saying, "You can never get your own book title straight. How did you expect to get Brittany's right?" So I'm going to do that again. And we're going to, of course, be linking to this. So Brittany Cole, which I got right, and it's author of Thrive Through It, a guide to redefine resilience, communicate with empathy, and practice allyship, which I guess is like allyship, which is like looking for alliances in life and business. So essentially, I remember last time we talked, you were on a WBC, a Women's Business Collaborative Forum, and the idea of making allies was something that was being addressed, and this is your thing. And so the whole DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, looking for allies, I might count as one, right? Because I'm interviewing you and trying to introduce you to my audience. So we'll dive into all that. We're going to talk about the diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to talk about what you do for work. But on this podcast, I like to talk to people about their lives first a little bit. Folks who watch this know where I come from. I came out of an evangelical background. I kind of fled that far right world and became I guess you could say, a progressive activist. I've written many books, and a lot of them have biographical material in them, going back into my childhood in an evangelical mission, why I left, the fact I got married very young. I've been married to the same woman for 52 years, have 3 grown kids and 5 grandchildren from whom I do childcare, and so forth and so on. So let's locate you in time and space here, not as an author first and someone who's an expert in the area of gender diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racial diversity, equity, and inclusion. But first of all, what sort of a background do you come from? Who were your mom and dad? Where did you grow up? What sort of home was it? And give us a little about yourself.
Sure. Well, one, Frank, thank you for having me on your show. And thank you for starting here, because I do believe that it's important. Anything that happens and that we choose professionally, it certainly stems from our personal lives. So I am the daughter of Kenneth and LaBrenda Johnson. They were married for about 34 years. I grew up in a really loving home with a dad who was and still is a pastor of a Baptist church. And I have 2 older brothers. And he would always tell us growing up that the biggest room in our house was the room for improvement. So we all kind of grew up with this sense of striving for excellence, but also knowing that you don't rest there. You're like in this continuous mode of continuous improvement, which is interesting considering what I get to do today. And then my mom, being one of the first Black women to integrate the University of South Carolina in Charleston. She was from Charleston, South Carolina. We were raised with just this really intense focus on education. So like I mentioned, 2 older brothers, daughter of a pastor. So definitely grew up in church, traveling to church. Actually, ironically, my dad pastored the church that my grandfather pastored, which was an hour away from where we lived. Yeah. So a native of Nashville, Tennessee, grew up there and went on to accepted an academic scholarship at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville to study political science and communications. I was on this pre-law path and just knew that that would be what I would choose to do for a career. And shortly after my sophomore year, was introduced to, or had been a part of an organization called Inroads, and Inroads introduced me to the world of corporate America through an internship. I started interning with Pfizer shortly after the summer between my sophomore and junior year of undergrad, and I interned for 2 summers, and they offered me a job offer. Like the fall semester of my senior year was too good to pass up. So I made all these concessions with I took the LSAT, but I'm like, well, I'm going to hold, and, I'll take this job and I'll, save money, and I get to live back in Nashville, and I've never been to law school. So that's how that went. Had a wonderful career at Pfizer as a commercial leader. And because I started there so early, I really saw a lot of, and with just standing on the shoulders of so many people who've poured into my life, really had I would say, rather accelerated growth there as a sales leader, as a marketing leader, and then getting to do DEI work at a Fortune 100 company. And so all of those experiences, I would say, shortly kind of sparked my entrepreneurial interests, which had kind of always been there. And in 2015, I started the first company, which now today I get to do leadership development, which is the work that I love doing. I consider it my life's work. I've always been doing it in some shape or form. It's just maybe a little more polished now as a business owner, but I get to spend my days doing speaking like this, coaching, and then helping companies create cultures where anyone can thrive, specifically women and Black professionals.
Well, when you look back at your Pfizer days, and now, of course, you're talking with people who are reaching out to try to help other women find allies within the business world in which they operate, and people who will help them out. Do you remember any particular women or men in the Pfizer household that you look back at as people who became your allies, either because you asked them to or through their own sense of generosity and inclusion, who kind of helped you along the way a little bit? And does anything stand out in terms of forming your thinking on that?
Certainly. Yeah, I can think of a few people that I would put into that bucket. And I think even more profound, or kind of what I think of as like the end all be all of allyship or being a great ally, is really being a sponsor. So it's creating opportunities, definitely leaning into your relationship capital as a leader to extend that to someone who may not have those same relationships or the same type of access. And so certainly, I mean, I can think of a guy, Chris, who was my regional manager, who was a very strong ally for me. I get to share stories about him often in the work that I do. A white male, probably mid 40s at the time, so relatively young considering the type of traditional organization that Pfizer at least was. And certainly, I mean, he would speak my names in rooms that I wasn't in. I would be one of the first people that he would recommend for leadership development opportunities. So certainly, he kind of helped to create inroads and paths for me to really do almost what I wanted to do at that organization. I think it's a testament to the company, the kind of culture that Pfizer has, but also I think a testament to just owning my own career, in that I got to do, when I think back, a lot of really cool kind of outside of the scope of my job title projects and work, and really create opportunities in terms of what I wanted to experience at work that, most people I don't think would maybe be able to say if they didn't have those kinds of sponsors or that kind of opportunity at a company like that.
Yeah, I remember I think it was in the context of one of the women's business collaboratives meetings, or maybe it was my podcast. I do so much on Zoom, it all merges. It's like, and sometimes I lose the thread, and it's like, are you interviewing me? Ask me a question. And then, oh no, I'm interviewing you. Okay. So a point that someone brought up that was very good the other day was this idea of allies, and practically speaking, okay, what do allies do? And she was talking about the fact that as a woman, she has been cut off and interrupted too many times by men, and that her male allies in the room would say, well, wait a minute, Jeff, didn't Brittany have something to say there? Wasn't she in the middle of something? How about you finish your thought, Brittany? Or Brittany comes up with an idea and it's a good one, but nobody pays much attention. And 5 minutes later, some man in the room puts the same thing forth, and then your ally comes back and says, well, wait a minute, Tom, that's what Brittany was saying 5 minutes ago. Let's let her unfold this a little more. Does that make any sense to you? It kind of rang a bell with me.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's definitely one of the many ways that an ally can show up. And I think oftentimes in the gender space, we think a lot about allyship through the lens of, well, as a woman, you need a male ally. And although I do believe that male allies are important, I also know that intersectionality is really important and having intersectional allies. So women can be allies of other women. So the
Sure.
same way, a Tom in the meeting could say, hey, that was Brittany's idea. Brittany, did you have anything else to add to that? Tiffany could do the same thing as an example. So certainly
Yeah.
that's one of many ways that an ally can show up professionally.
Yeah, I've been interviewing quite a few women who are in various fields. The last interview we did in this kind of, on this subject was with someone who was an executive at Microsoft and has been there for 30 years. And now I think she's on the board as well. And of course, in her field, there's a dearth of women tech people. So she's sort of not unique, but really stands out. And I'm wondering, you went into Pfizer and it's a sort of a sciencey company, but you were on the marketing side and so forth and so on. But did you find that Pfizer had created some sort of an environment where women on the science side of things would come in as scientists working in Pfizer, or was it that situation where the women found themselves more in the HR or the marketing? How do you look back on that for Pfizer? And then how does that translate into the sort of aims that you now have as you write your book about thriving? Because it seems to me that it isn't just a question of inclusion. It's always inclusion in a range of jobs within a corporation, not just the jobs that some corporations sort of, quote, expect women to do.
Certainly. Yeah. So I would say, reflecting on my time at Pfizer, certainly, and most of my work was in the commercial space, I'll say that. So I wasn't in the science space as much, but I do know a lot of the data that you would see in a Lean In and McKinsey study is the same type of experiences that you saw there and at other organizations. And that's that at entry level roles, you see diversity, you see decent diversity. Most organizations have diversity in their company. The question does come back to inclusion, and really it's an equity question, because as you look at leadership, the leadership oftentimes does not even represent, forget communities, right? You hear companies say that a lot, right? We want, diversity that represents the communities and clients that we serve. And it's like, well, let's just look back at your entry level. Does your leadership representation match the diversity that you see at entry level? And most of the time, the answer to that question is no. So, for me, how that informed my experiences, certainly those sponsors helped me. So I was able to, I would say much earlier than most colleagues, because of my early entry into Pfizer, navigate into those spaces, sooner, many would say. Often I remember times where I was definitely the only, woman of color in the room, definitely only Black woman in the room, and certainly the youngest in the room around a leader, a board table at a leader meeting. But also it certainly informs the work that I do, because I wrote and also lead this work from a place of experience. So it's not just about being the researcher, but oftentimes it is also about being the witness. I mean, I can remember a lot of the instances that I talk about, that we read about, that we see on television, that I hear other leaders talk about. I'm like, yeah, I know what that feels like to be, just as you shared, in a meeting and be talked over or to be talked around, and to say, okay, do I say that again? Do I speak up? Do I interrupt? I don't want to be perceived as being angry. Like having those thoughts in your mind about how do I even navigate that microaggression in the midst of this meeting. So certainly it informs my work today for sure.
Yeah, so I'm interested in the history because, when you write a book like you have, in terms of a guide to redefine resilience, and we'll go through the whole title again in a minute and put it up, that obviously comes from somewhere. So now just to jump back, and by the way, this is in conversation with Frank Schaeffer. My guest is Brittany Cole, who does many things. We are talking about those many things. But Brittany, when you jump back into the fact you were raised in a church environment, and the kind of spirituality that you brought with that. I look at my own journey. I pray, but I don't have the intellectual commitment to the evangelicalism I was raised with. I'm just wondering, when you get together with your family, your brothers, and look back on that childhood, are you at a different place in terms of your own faith journey and philosophical journey, however you would talk about that, than you were, say, when you were sitting next to your mom in church on any given Sunday? What's that arc for you? And it relates to what you're doing now, but I'm just curious because it's something that, of course, I write a lot about in terms of my own interests.
Yeah, well, it's definitely different, Frank, and it's interesting that you asked that question because, for me, and similarly, I know with your experiences as well, like growing up as a pastor's daughter, we were at everything.
Yeah.
Like if there was something happening, even when there wasn't anything happening, we were there. And so when I think about like that experience compared to, my faith experience now, or at least the way that it is outwardly expressed,
Mm.
it's very different. It's like, do I even belong at a church? I mean, I know that I do, but it's like, I'm not, I'm not leading the women's ministry. I'm not leading the youth ministry. I'm not, in the
Yeah.
choir, just all of these different things that were a part of my experience. But what I would say is that my faith is stronger today. So it's just a different, I think, priority around relationship and, truly understanding what faith means. And it's not only what you can see in practice or what you can outwardly express as your faith practice. I think a lot of it has to do with, belief and mindset and just an assuredness of what you believe in, which for me, I know is certainly deeper, which has come through, experiences, even though it may not show up the same way. I certainly believe that my faith has grown much more and is much stronger today, than it was then.
Was the church you grew up in, what kind of denomination was it? I'm curious.
It was Baptist.
Sort of what kind of Baptist? Because there's lots of different kinds of Baptists.
Yeah, there is. So I would say probably a traditional Black Baptist,
Okay.
if that's a category. So like not quite Southern Baptist,
Yeah.
but certainly, I mean, and I grew up in a very small church. So
Sure.
I mentioned the commuting because when I reflect on the experience, like the church family truly felt like a family because it was a
Yeah.
small congregation, but it was also a very different congregation than, say, the people that I grew up with, Monday through Saturday, just from
Yeah.
in terms of like being progressive and like, wanting more for their lives versus like I go to church and everyone's fine, like where they are. And it's kind of just a completely different experience, which for me, I believe taught me humility in a different way
Yeah.
because, truly it was about love and family and, and then I jump back into like Monday through Friday and it's about like career and money and wealth and what's next, So for me, we grew up with kind of this really good balance of different ways of living. And there's no like one right way. It's just about owning your path and, having faith in what you believe in and moving forward in purpose.
Do you find in your writing and speaking on the subjects which now interest you in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and all the rest of this, that you are able to draw something from that background, but not obliquely, but directly, as in actually, in what you write about yourself, go back into the fact that you came out of that very intensely spiritual, religious background and how it's informed your own journey? Because at some point, obviously, given the fact you're now dealing with a series of what you might call non-financial issues, such as diversity, equity, inclusion, which fundamentally have a spiritual, moral base to them, or nothing. I mean, it's not just about earning more money, although companies that treat their people well do earn more. But I just wondered how much you dare draw on that. And I'll give you an analogy. My daughter's a CEO in New York, and she was telling me that one of the refreshing things about being stuck at home during COVID was at last all these predominantly white male business leaders she worked with were on the phone saying, I've got to talk quietly because I just put my toddler down to sleep. And at last she knew they had families too. And so it's right. Like, wait a minute, this guy who was all business and you've got to be serious and come into work on the weekends and, answer all your emails. And suddenly it's like, he's whispering because he just put his toddler down for a nap. So the field got a little more level. And she said, what it's taught me is from now on my, what do you call it? It's CV is the English term for.
Yeah. Curriculum vitae.
Yeah. So she says, well, I went back and rewrote it and I put at the beginning what I've always felt to be true. And that is I've learned far more from being a mother of two and raising two children than I ever learned from anything in business. And damn it, I'm going to say it now. I'm not hiding anymore. And so I just wonder, both with women and men too, because men don't take paternity leave because they think it'll make them look less serious and all this nonsense. So women are out there, basically saying, yeah, I'm in the office, but actually it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they're picking their kid up at school. Well, similarly, it seems to me, those of us who come from a faith background sometimes are a bit reticent to say, to present what we're doing not so much in technical terms, but in moral terms related to the things we actually hold dear, because it's sort of not cool to say it. And I just wonder, this is totally off the chart here, but now I've gotten interested in talking to you. Like
Yeah.
we just met over coffee or something. So this isn't great interview material on a book, but I'm so interested in you, Brittany, and I'm just wondering how it's informed your journey, because you deal in an area that's right on the cutting edge of the big moral discussions of our day. How does this all work for you?
Yeah, so I would say my faith is everything. And for me, so similar to your daughter, my experience just came through the death of my mother. So one of my biggest lessons in my own grief journey was that I realized that I was trying to compartmentalize my life. And a lot of that just came through like the, kind of corporate grooming is what I recognize it to be now, but like starting in corporate very, very young, coupled with my packaging. I'm a Black woman and oftentimes was the only in the room. I kind of learned, and even almost like by osmosis, it wasn't even that, I had a few people that would tell me like, these are the unwritten rules. This is the way to go about and advance at this company. But also just through like the experiences, it was very much, here's my personal life. Here's my faith life. Here's my Pfizer life. Here's my, and I tried to live this compartmentalized life until I had to go back to work after the death of my mother. And I could not emotionally any longer hold up the mask of this is work Brittany, because personal broken heart Brittany was spilling over at work. And it got to a point where it's like, it's quite visible, and so it ended up being a blessing for me just to like recognize that that's really not real, and we try to I think live like that to a point of being in a bit of survival mode of trying to say, okay, I'm hurting and I'm suffering in silence, but let me show up at work like everything is great because this is the way that you advance and this is how I need to show up and this is how I need to speak and this is how I need to navigate meetings, when really at the heart of any business, right, is this thing we call emotional intelligence for a reason, like the emotions matter. So certainly, and that for me, it comes through faith. And I talk about faith quite a bit in my book. And I love when you can have conversations like this that are not, Christian conversations, but certainly as a part of that, not living a compartmentalized life, like my faith shows up in everything that I do. I may not be wearing a cross, but certainly it's my belief. So I move and speak and work and act from that place because that's just who I am. And so, yeah, I think it shows up in everything for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting to me. Now, let's get to the book specifically. Do you have a hard copy of the book handy?
I do, with tabs.
Okay.
What did I write?
I see it behind you on the shelf, but I didn't want to make you turn around and hold. No, don't take it away quickly. Hold it back up again. Okay. All right, because and I want you to put it near the camera so you can really look at this. Okay. Now, when did this book come out?
So this book came out the end of December of 2020.
Okay, so it's fairly recent. It's been out for a while. And the kind of people that you pictured writing it for, as in, okay, you're filling a need. It has a very specific title. You were asking for something. You were telling people what to do, in effect, in terms of reaching out to them. Mm-hmm. Who has the audience for the book actually turned out to be? And tell me a little bit of the reactions you get to it as a way of getting into the book itself and telling us what you are arguing for in the book specifically. So I'm not putting words in your mouth of what I think you're saying. I want to hear what you think you're saying.
Sure. Well, yeah, the whole premise of the book, or as Donald Miller would say, the controlling idea of the book is that bouncing back isn't real. So this idea of resilience that we have, that we're supposed to go through something hard or challenging and then go back to the place that we were in before that happened, isn't really effective. Let's just say that. And so the book is about how do we recognize that, one, but then how do you extrapolate the lessons from loss, from change, from challenge to journey forward, oftentimes in a new way, in a way.
Let's just take that and unpack it a little bit before we go on. Talk about the kind of loss you're talking about, if it relates maybe to your personal life as well, your experiences, and then the kind of, I love this idea that we just, hey, buck it up, she fought so well, and, resilience and all this business. Talk more about that, how this kind of false idea of easy resilience and bouncing back. How do you see coming out of a tragic moment as in a way that really mirrors who we are, and deal with it in a better way? Let's talk about not just what the book talks about. Give me some actual content from the book, because I really think this is a great point.
Yeah. So, we've talked about identity and faith, and certainly it's a part of this as well. So, as a Black woman, and you asked who the book is for, and then we can talk about who have been the purchasers of the book. But I certainly had Black women in mind when I wrote this book. And that's simply because we kind of naturally, historically, and I won't even go down that path, live from a place of having to be resilient.
Yeah.
Right. So you learn how to model sometimes a pseudo strength that isn't even real. Right. So it goes back to like this idea of the mask and, showing up and being superwoman and saving everybody in every situation that does more harm than good to you. Right. Emotionally and mentally. And so this idea of, who the book was for or what resilience really means is like helping really to kind of redefine how we think about that word and certainly the expression of it, that resilience doesn't mean that I always have to show up and pretend to be strong, because a lot of times that's what it is. We're pretending. We don't really feel that way, but we feel like we have to exude it in order to be perceived as a leader or in order to be perceived as someone, that can be taken seriously or whatever the case may be, particularly in a career context. And so for me, this is about, one, helping us to understand how grief shows up. And so I talk about in the book, certainly the grief journey that I experienced in the death of my mother, but also career grief, which is very real, and very real, stories and examples from my own corporate career where I didn't realize I was grieving, but I was.
Talk about your mom, the grief for her, and then talk about this very specific corporate grieving. Those are such powerful ideas. I just want to get some details on both.
Sure. So I'll give you a quick story. I'll just reverse the order. So in 2014, I had my first opportunity to transition from sales into marketing, which is pretty huge in the corporate space, and was with a huge brand, Viagra. So, I used to have to say when people asked what I did or where I worked, I'd say, Pfizer, and pre-pandemic. When I see people, what's that company? I say, the company that makes Viagra. And then people are like, oh, yeah.
We know, we heard of that.
Right. I don't have to do that anymore. But so in 2014, I had a chance to not a chance, but I earned an opportunity to join that team as a marketer, and ended up having to turn down the job because I was getting married 7 weeks later. The short story is my husband was going back to grad school. He got into Emory. This role was—
When was that? Give us a date.
2000. This was November of 2014. We were getting married in December of 2014. Yep. So I ended up turning down the job at the company that I still worked in as a Black woman. It was a mess. So I also love personal branding for that reason, but I won't get into that because I had to truly rebrand myself inside of my company because people didn't take me serious. I'm like, what do you mean you're turning down the job? Like, what do you mean? Like, we know you're get married and then move up here. What are you talking about? But I didn't make that decision. And so I spent 2 years grieving. And I didn't have the language for it, of course, until after, but I'm like, that is what I was feeling.
Okay, so just to interrupt you there. Now, how is this working out with your husband? Because we're getting all personal.
That's why I was grieving.
we're doing a close-up thing here. So we're talking about death and grieving and husbands. And so now it's Katie bar the door. We've got open the door here to really dig deep. So tell me really about the grieving process and what was going on. Because it's involved with getting married and you're making these decisions. What's the anatomy of this drama?
Yeah, so I turned the job down in November. He made that decision and I was aligned with it, even though I would have chosen something different had I not been almost getting married. And we got married in December. And all of 2015, when I say grieving, it was showing up more so in my house than at work. But it was just the emotional trauma of like resentment and being upset and like crying out of nowhere. And I didn't know that like what I was experiencing was this loss of expectation, this loss of, who I thought I would be if I would have taken this opportunity to work for this really big brand in this major role. And I turned it down. So that was kind of my first. And then, of course, the reputation repair that I was having to do every day, showing up at work, explaining why, I made the decision that I did, recognizing I still had the same aspiration. So that led me, you asked about the grief journey with my mom. He graduated. So our kind of agreement I guess back to my household, was that once he graduated from grad school, we would both be in a good place to make a move to New York. And he held true to that. He graduated, did a 1-year accelerated MBA program, and we relocated to New York in 2017. He actually moved up 6 months before I did because he landed his job first. And so I'm in New York. I'm like, okay, I finally did it. I got the marketing job. Everything worked out. And 3 months, this was March of 2017. And 3 months later, my mom died unexpectedly. So that's kind of why I said I would reverse the order, because I felt like I had come out of this like grief experience and I had triumphed, and, you know, I got the job and it was, everything was amazing. We're living in the Big Apple. We're in the middle of Manhattan. Life is great. And then 3 months after that was when my mom died. And so it certainly felt like, you know, just the rug was just snatched from up under me, and I like fell and hit my head on a concrete, you know, ground. And I was just trying to figure out life after that experience.
Well, now you're in Asheville. So just fill in the gap for me here between New York and being back in Asheville. Then what?
Yep. So I stayed in New York for about 2 years, and I took a promotion to lead a sales team back here in Nashville. And about 2 weeks after I took the role, I got told that my role, the new role, was going to be eliminated and that I was up for a layoff. But there were these other, you know, opportunities I could take, or I could take a package and leave. And I felt like that was a God moment. And I decided to take the package and take the leap of faith into full-time entrepreneurship. So that was 2019.
And the entrepreneurship that you engaged in with what you're doing, and we're going to get into that, has worked out to the extent that, you know, you've got a nice bookshelf behind you and a book. So I imagine, you know, you're not, if we pull back the camera a little bit, you're indoors and you have a roof over your head. So something's working out. How did everything work after that, in terms of, you know, the move that you made with your husband and now you're back there and so forth? Did he come back down with you, or how did that do?
Yeah, he was ready to come back because, kind of as you would imagine, New York was about my career, although he was able to work at, like, he's an architect. So he worked at the top architecture firm in the world, had a great career experience while there too. But certainly if it was his decision, he would have never moved to New York. So
and what's he up to now as we speak?
He owns his own firm as well.
And so
he's the business owner also.
Yeah. So I guess I'm fishing around the edges here. Just, you know, so you guys are good.
Yeah, well, so let me share with you. So we moved back in 2018.
Yeah.
I got this word about this role actually isn't going to be available. It's going away in 2019. So I left in 2019. So we've gone from, you know, two household earning, you know, great salaries to, okay, we got one entrepreneur and I had a package for like a year, which, you know, was super blessed to have that scenario, which I felt like was part of the, like, okay, you're supposed to take this leap. But then enter pandemic, and March of 2020, he was let go. So we went from, like, you know, two great salaries, everything's great, to like, okay, wait, now we're both, you know, full-time entrepreneurs. And you know, I would say we've been super blessed. Like, I always feel a little tension saying this, but certainly the pandemic for my business. So I own a leadership development firm. So I'm in the business of people, and, you know, it has helped our business, you know, the work that we do, where I feel like, you know, maybe before the pandemic, I would spend a lot of time talking about why it was needed. Like, I don't have to have those conversations today. So
people get it.
So yeah, it's definitely helped. And then for him, we live in Nashville, so Nashville's booming. So he's doing well also.
So he's got a job at another firm, or is he working on his own?
He has his own firm.
Okay. And that's working okay.
It is.
We got to have some happy ending here. Okay?
Yes. Yes. His business is doing well. My business is doing well. So
all right. Okay. And
we both made the right career decisions.
On this, on In Conversations with Frank Schaeffer, we never insist on success, because, you know, my whole point of view is we have the wrong ideas about success. So to go back to something you said way early in our conversation, which I thought was intriguing, was this idea of the dichotomy between the sort of religion, Saturday, Sunday, and church, and all the rest. Then the week is all about money and education and striving and getting ahead. So now you've written a book on resilience, saying that we have silly ideas about resilience, that you can just tough it out. You really have to deal with it, which I think is incredibly wise. And it seems like your own life sort of forced you into thinking about, how do I get this spiritual life of ultimate values put together with this striving, fighting for position part of my life. And then you went through all these crises, which sort of got your attention. So where are you at now? Are you more about striving and position and success in the way that Wall Street defines, or are you more about a whole life kind of approach for you personally, Brittany, your husband, and how you run your business? Where's your head at?
Yeah. So I would definitely say for me, it's a bit of both. I definitely know for sure that my professional pursuit looks a lot different. So whereas, I felt like I was doing a lot of, inside of corporate, I mean, I hope it's not as much of this today, but certainly there's okay, like what's my networking schedule of like people that I need to follow up with, and like who do I need to be, there's just this like continuous thought of how you need to be kind of positioning yourself in order to thrive in your career. Whereas today I do feel like, and this for me is about growing in faith. Like I firmly believe that I'll never miss anything that's for me. So even if it's something where I'm like, wow, I should have made that decision, or like, was that the wrong move? I believe I'll be redirected right back around to it, even if I missed it the first time. Like that's just a belief that I have. So I think from that place, and maybe not believing that firmly in that idea early in my career, I believe my just approach. So it's not that I don't still, work hard and like, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur. It's like, I'm not earning money, I'm making it. So it's like, you got to be out here to make it. But it's from this place for me of authenticity. It's from this place of like, if I get the sense that you're not the right client, I don't care what the contract says, I don't have to work with you. And I just have a sense of ownership and like power that I think early in my career I did not have, that I do believe comes through experiences, but also growing in faith. And so certainly life is much more about, purpose. It's about, having a sense of peace in your home and in the work that you choose to do. But I certainly have a strong value of ownership in that I get to choose, I get to choose the kind of experience that I want to have. I get to choose the kind of clients that I get to work with. And, I don't believe that that's just because I'm an entrepreneur. I think we all have that kind of power, specifically as believers, if we tap into it and really believe that we can shape our lives truly to be aligned with what we believe.
Yeah, one thing I want to get back to this, what you do day to day in terms of how you advise people and the whole diversity, equity, inclusion, just the parameter. Let's just talk about that. When we talk about this, I'm thinking of gender, I'm thinking about race, non-binary people, the gay community, and so forth. When you talk to folks about this, I just want to get clear. You're advising people on how to put things together on the entrepreneurship side, but also just dealing with things as you do in your book. But you're also pushing for these diversity, equity, inclusion agenda. How does that fit together in terms of your own schedule of what you speak on, where you go, who draws on your work, and where the emphasis is that you place in the way you coach people? How does that all work together? Because they seem like two different things a little bit.
Yeah, so the core of the work that I do is helping companies cultivate a culture, an organizational culture where everyone can thrive. So what that looks like most of the time is working with either human resources, DE&I, or C-suite leaders inside of corporations. So
typically, do they bring you in? Do you do this on Zoom? How does this work?
So through the pandemic, it was pretty much all on Zoom. So any speaking, workshops, training, all on Zoom, and still a good bit of Zoom today, just because most of the companies that we work with, they haven't had like they're being more open to what returning to the office looks like. So a lot of it ends up being on Zoom. Most of the strategy work I end up coming in for. So whether it's coming in to meet with the C-suite team or coming in to help to facilitate some type of assessment with an HR team, I usually come in for those sorts of things. Coaching is almost all virtual. And
is coaching one-on-one, or you're coaching a corporate group of people, several people in a room? How does that work?
Yeah, so we have a growing team of coaches. And so most of our leadership development programs, I mean, I believe and have experienced the benefits of coaching. So most of our programs include a coaching component. So we provide coaching at scale with diverse coaches, which typically isn't the case inside of corporate. So typically in corporate, coaching is reserved on one or of two ends of the spectrum. It's either performance-based, so you're on a PIP or performance improvement plan. You need a coach to get up to, expectation, or it's reserved for executive level leaders. It's reserved for senior leaders. So you've got all these emerging leaders in the middle where most of your diversity is that's never experienced having a coach. And so that's where we come in.
Let me back up there a minute. So when you are coaching, pretend for a second that I'm a client, and what are you telling me to do that I'm not doing most typically? What are the sort of broad strokes issues where you're encouraging me to do something I may not have thought of? And what would that include when it comes to DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? How does that all fit together into one set of advice? So, if I'm an oncologist, I'm saying, show up for your appointments, take your medication. Here's what you do. Coach me a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm going to be technical here, but I think it's important.
Be technical. Just explain, if you're going to use acronyms, tell us what it means.
Yes. So as a coach, I'm not telling you to do anything, because a coach's job is to ask the right questions that draw out the answers from you. So when I'm showing up as a coach, I'm getting a better understanding of what are your goals, Frank, especially in the scope of career. So you're looking to advance or make some sort of transition in your career. I'm getting more clear on what your vision, your aspirations, your goals are. And then I'm helping you think and see those blind spots that maybe you don't see through asking questions.
What are the most typical blind spots? Let's go there then. I mean, what do you hear again and again and again? And you find yourself saying, wow, I've said this 10 times already this week. Why can't anybody get it?
Yeah. So in the context of the conversation we've been having today, when in coaching women inside of companies, it's around speaking up.
Oh, okay.
Right? And it's around imposter syndrome of, do I say this? Is this the right thing to say? How's it going to land? Like, you're overthinking it, right? So it's like coaching to be able to say, yes, you're in a Teams meeting, or yes, you're in a Zooms meeting, but you also have this career aspiration that you just told me, right? You want to go from senior manager to director. You're not going to make that transition sitting in the meeting and not contributing to it. So let's talk about what that looks like, right? So it's coaching in that space. Consulting is different. Consulting, I am going to tell you, right? So as a consultant that shows up, there's still this coaching layer to it. But if I'm working in a consulting engagement with a DEI leader that's new, which has been the trend to the role over the last year and a half, it's helping them really see around the corner and helping them to assess, right? Is the implicit bias training the right thing? Is that activity or is that progress? Right? Is that in alignment with where we are saying that we want to go, or where you're saying, hey, we have these representation goals? Is that really what's needed? Or do we need to make sure that leaders are accountable to these diversity targets? Do we need to be talking about performance management and making sure they're equipped to hire and to advance diverse talent? So certainly showing up in that context is a little bit different, where I am leaning on my expertise to make recommendations. And of course, they've got the final decision, but I'm showing up in a bit more in a bit more of a directive way as a consultant than I am as a coach, really just kind of asking questions to draw out so that you're making the best decision and coming up with the best answer for your career.
Do you have a little narrative in your head while you're coaching people that goes something like this? Let's say you were an environmentalist and you'd be saying, here's a corporation telling me they want to clean up their oil drilling project. Is this greenwashing and they're just trying to look good? Or do they really, is their heart really in this? Do they really believe climate change is going to destroy the planet and they're racking their brains on how to change? It would seem to me, as someone sitting there who is a woman, who is Black, who comes from your background, that you have a little inner dialogue sometimes in your head that you're not sharing with people.
A little.
And you're just saying to yourself, this guy is just full of shit, and I'm talking to someone who's just hired me to make himself look good. They're never really going to change anything. I'm window dressing to get them, this is a PR thing. It's not really about structural change. This is an afterthought. And then, and I'm not being a cynic, on the good side, you'd be saying, wow, I'm so surprised. This white older guy, or this woman who's all about career advancement, or, whomever, really seems to care about doing better this way. And I'm going to give them I'm really going to make an effort on this one because they really mean it. and then all points in between. Do you find people on both spectrums? And let's hear what goes on in your head. I put words in, I've written some dialogue for you. You don't have to use bad words. I just want to know what you're thinking.
Well, Frank, you're pretty spot on. I will say, at this point, given the amount of attention that's been on this topic, and just being really grateful to work with a lot of really great companies, I have a good radar. Like, I can kind of tell in some of those upfront conversations when it is more performative. And I am certainly thinking in my head, okay, noted, they just said this, they just said this. They're really concerned about, the employer branding, and how can we make sure that, our board and our shareholders and our community understands what we're doing. And it's like, okay, well, what are you really doing? Yeah, so certainly, certainly a lot of that. I'll share this one thing. A kind of a yellow flag word for me in this space is initiative.
Okay, right? Well, I'm going to write that down, and never, I have not used it once in this conversation. I'm so happy.
No, I mean in the DEI space, right?
Because I know, but I'm just joking.
Short term. So anytime I hear initiative, I'm like, okay, are they really in this for the right reasons, or is this really an initiative to where we're doing this for the next 3 months and then we're done with that? Yeah. So.
Yeah, because it seems, you're also in a delicate position because you're a person of integrity. We know this about you, but if you're coming to a company that's kind of been forced into the position of Johnny come lately, make themselves look good, perfect. We're gonna do that. We're gonna have an initiative, and we're gonna sort of dress this all up. We want to include more women, but of course not too many, because we don't actually want a female CEO leading our company, or the sort of bro culture. We'll have somebody in marketing and HR, but God forbid they actually come into the creative service circle and spear our, dilute our old boys network or whatever. How do you deal with that? And how, might I say, in your face do you ever get when you're just sort of pissed off and you want to say, look, you guys are the problem and you're going to have to change? Do you find yourself using kind of arguments just drawn from business? Look, you would make more money if you included women and Black women more, and look at, here's how it works, and diversity pays off. Or, do you ever go sort of to like, hey, how can you live with yourselves if you keep going this way? Or, how do you present it when you know that you're pulling teeth here and nobody's really with you?
Yeah, so I look at the work of DEI the way that I look at the work of any other sector of business. So it has been proven time and time again to be a business imperative. So it certainly is about your P&L. So I think from that vantage point, I try to align the approach to sales. I was a former sales leader, the approach to marketing, other areas of business, to the way that we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So an example of that, is about alignment. And if I am in a conversation with leaders, especially, before we decided to work together, and I feel like we're misaligned, right? I'm always willing to educate, right? Leadership development at its core is about, we're really in the business of helping people unlearn what they thought they knew, right? And relearn information that helps them get to where they're trying to go. So I'm always willing to educate. I'm always willing to, have a conversation about the business need or why DEI is good for business. And then after that point, right, I'm in the business of educating. I'm not in the business of convincing, to say it succinctly. So, if I don't believe that we're aligned, if I'm doing more convincing than educating, and I can tell that throughout the engagement, I'm going to be met with resistance at every turn, I just don't take the work. Yeah.
So coming from a church background, do you ever go to the "Thus saith the Lord" and your butt's going to burn in hell unless you do this? I mean,
I don't, but sometimes I feel a little bit like that. And I tell you, it's the beauty of being, an external consultant, because there is this level of credibility that's baked into the work that I get to do, to where they listen. And sometimes it'll be like, I'll be working with a DI leader and they're like, Brittany, will you go talk to, insert title person? And it's like, they listen to you. And it's like, Brittany said, and I'm like, oh, wait, I don't know if I want that kind of weight, it's like, I'm sharing with you and I feel confident in what I'm sharing, but yeah, I do feel that a little bit from that perspective of just like, and for me, right, it goes back to values alignment, right? Because of that, because I know the impact that we have at the level that we're working with this line of work.
Yeah.
It's extremely expansive. It's enterprise kind of work. It's not just like, hey, come do this training. And so like a lot of the work that we're doing, it's like it really impacts people's experiences. So for me, I go back to what I was mentioning earlier about being the witness. Like, you know, it's work that impacts that one Black woman that's on that team, and she's the only, and her experience every day when she turns on her computer or when she goes back into the office. Like the work that we're doing has the kind of experience to really or impact to really shape how people experience work and thus their life, because they are not detached. And so, you know, I do take that really seriously and to heart. So yeah, but I do get that, you know, I don't know if it's thus said, but it's like
That's
Brittany
good.
said, yeah.
Hey, you know, one question I always have, again, because my daughter's in the world of business in New York right now, but also just in general with you and other women that I'm talking to, this issue of not speaking up, putting yourself forward and so forth. You know, from a male perspective of an older, you know, white guy who's been in part of this elite structure, although, you know, as a as a self-employed or self-unemployed writer, I don't feel too much part of an elite structure a lot of the time when I'm standing hat in hand begging a publisher to do something with my book. It's like,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
But anyway, I think there's always two sides to this, and I don't know where your head is at on it. And I really don't have an opinion. This is a real question. It's not loaded. One part of this equation is, you know, women should speak up more, but there's another part of me saying the business structure is so oriented towards chest thumping hubris toxicity that why should women have to change their method of operation when actually it's the men who ought to just listen more and be more caregiving and much less part of this fabric. And, you know, I feel the same thing about family leave. I mean, why does a woman have to prove she needs family leave after having a baby? What's that got to do with being a female? How about males being caregivers too? You know, why aren't men taking paternity leave and demanding it? So I just wonder where your head's at, because one part of me says one of the big mistakes in the 70s, you know, that I think the feminist movement made, which was to not differentiate between the goal of being allowed to have a place at the table, but a bigger goal of changing the damn table. It's got to be, it has to include more, but it can't only be that, you know, it's not, don't imitate white male executives from 1940 to 1970. Ask for a different deal that actually suits the human condition, because we all evolved as caretakers. We're only, you and me are only here today talking because somebody in our ancestral past took care of somebody, you know, not made money from them, and not, you know, horrible things happen, but somebody cared. Otherwise, we're not here today. So how do you, in your view of business, differentiate between the kind of band-aid solution of speak up and play with the big boys to challenge the whole damn thing and say, why should anybody who's quiet, sitting in a meeting, doing their job, you know, why have they got to suddenly change the way they operate and be part of this club in order to be effective? How about change the club? How about change the rules?
Yeah. And the question there is, you know, where is the problem? So, you know, to the point that you were making, right? Everything that we talk about in the DEI space, it comes down to equity. It's really not about diversity. Diversity is a fact. You have it. Inclusion is the act. That's the behavior that we're trying to drive. So helping people be more empathetic, be more curious, all of those kinds of competencies that ladder up to cultivating psychological safety. So there is inclusion. And then there's equity. Equity is about outcomes. So if you're trying to impact outcomes, the question to impact outcomes is, what are the conditions that hold this status quo that now we want to change in place? And the conditions question is never about those that are being harmed by the condition. The conditions question is always about those that are in power that uphold that condition. So with that in mind, certainly my approach and our team's approach to this work, which is why we're a leadership development firm and we're not a DEI firm, is because this work comes down to leadership. It comes down to the leaders saying, we've got to do something different. Our approach here isn't working because the conditions that hold this all white male leadership in place is not what we want anymore. And so instead of going to women and saying, hey, here's how you need to alter change, because mind you, that's been done. So oftentimes, I find myself having to remind or educate, it really goes back to educating people on the work of DEI. This work was introduced into corporations through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It started with racial equity. And so out of that, companies who are found guilty of discriminating after that federal legislation, their leaders had to go through diversity training. And in the 70s, you mentioned the 70s, the work of diversity was about assimilation. It was about how do we bring Black people into a corporate environment and make them look like what's here, right? History and facts tell us that did not work. So the work of today, much to your point, is like, we're not trying to change the woman per se, sure, right? Back to continuous improvement. There's some ways to be better, but really this is about the conditions, right? What keeps her from speaking up? And that's what we need to prioritize changing first.
Yeah, no, I really, really agree with you. Someone we're going to be interviewing in April is actually two sisters, Dr. Taya Scott and Karen Scott, and they're both medical people. And one of them is a historian of the way, I know this sounds off topic, but it isn't. I'm coming to something. One of them is, they're both Black women, and one of them is a historian of the way that the modern practice of OBGYN medicine in the South developed as part of the slave culture in working with white masters to make sure that the babies were being delivered to be, future into slavery. And I bring this up because some of the women that I've interviewed on this already, and I had a long talk with them personally, by the way, just a little while ago. The three of us had a wonderful chat for a long time. And then I'm bringing them back to interview them properly. But what always boggles my mind, and this is why I brought that up, is that, I read and I've been around the block and I consider myself, kind of progressive on these issues, but I keep stumbling on things which really shock me. Like her history of the way the OB practices in the South, and a lot of modern OB practice developed around this kind of racialized need to breed, quote, breed, on the plantation culture and so forth. So when you talk about gender equity, and then you're doing that as a Black woman, and then you're doing that in the United States, anywhere in the country, it just seems to me that the depth of what we don't know and what hasn't been dealt with is so vast when it comes to these issues of equity, and especially when you're talking about women and Black women. I wouldn't even know where to start in terms of addressing it. These are huge things. So how does what I'd call the sort of big historical perspective of being a Black woman in the United States of America in 22, in this year, that whole history impact what you're able to do within the corporate world, almost like the elephant in the room, don't mention it because that's just too big a thing to go to. So we'll just start with something we can get our head around, but let's not go to the big underlying historical problem that has never been resolved in this country. How does that whole history impact you? I mean, you grew up in a Black church, so you're in an environment that's very aware of all this. And I'm always just curious about that because it just seems to me so big that I hardly even know how to begin to think or address the issue myself at all. And I'm just wondering, and here you are right on the front lines and the cusp of trying to come up with a better kind of solution and coaching people. This is where you get the preacher out of you, that church background, because there's a real war here that's huge, in addition to the DEI battle within the corporate world. This corporate world exists in a country, and the country is the United States of America with its history. How does that all fit together?
Yeah, well, you mentioned faith, and it's not quite a scripture, but I think we can extrapolate. There's this faith belief that you can only heal what you will reveal. So if you never show what's actually happening, just like you mentioned, like, how do we address it? Well, that's where we start. We address it. So even what I shared with you about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that's something that we embed in almost all of our learning and development, because it is a reminder to those that know, and oftentimes new information for, most of the leaders that go through our curriculum, that, oh, we didn't just wake up in 2020 with this great idea to start prioritizing DEI, right? There was the very unfortunate murder of, that I think for many companies, like, and we have some partners that we work with that'll say, well, we were doing DEI work before the murder of George Floyd. But I think, for most companies, even if you were doing something, it became a resurgence for you, or became prioritized. And for most of our companies, it has at the very least elevated the priority. So, from that place, right, it's incumbent upon leaders to say, okay, we got to talk about how we got here. And for us, it's like that reminder of, yes, certainly the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it involves everyone, right? DEI is everybody's job. It's also important to recognize where this work started. And it started because of the systemic racial challenges in the United States. It started with legislation, two things that we don't like to talk about, right? It started with race and it started with politics. The only reason why I'm here today is because of legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the introduction of diversity training into corporate America. There wasn't any before. So, for us, it's about reminding of that history. Like, we are here because this is where we started. And it's important that we understand that. And that helps us point to where we're trying to go. And I think the other piece of that is holding up the work of gender diversity, because when you look at the work of gender diversity, there have been great strides there that have been in many cases faster than the work of racial equity. And you ask yourself the question why, and kind of try to mirror, okay, what happened there with what's happening as far as racial equity. And any DEI data that you look at will show you that the demographic of diversity that's benefited the most from the work since the late 1960s has been white women. So going back to the idea of allyship, right? We need not just white men, but white women also to be better allies of other women and of people of color.
Yeah, and of course you have little footnotes there too about white women who have caregivers for their children, who are sometimes Black women, sometimes people of color, sometimes from another country, who have not always been taken care of very well. So, that's part of the problem. I want to ask you something. It's a pretty sort of go from what we were talking about before to this question. And it's kind of a big question. And again, it's an elephant in the room, but I think it needs to be addressed. And that is, how sometimes corporate culture is asked to react to something, so Vladimir Putin attacks Ukraine, and then we get a list of what businesses are leaving Russia, some are staying and doing business, and there's a culpability there. And so forth. In a similar vein, there's a whole bunch of states now where the state legislature has been taken over by people who seem pretty bent on creating new voter restrictions that, unless I'm paranoid and delusional, which I don't think I am, see pretty clearly aimed at minority communities and trying to get them to vote less for political reasons. So at some point, does corporate culture speak up and say, you know what, if this state legislator really does bring in this voter suppression law, we're out of fill in the blank, whatever the state is, we're moving our corporate headquarters because we're not going to be part of this, or we're not going to have our convention in their town. That happens on other issues. How much have you thought about this, and how much does that come up, even if it's just in personal conversation? Because at some point, is corporate America really just going to sit there and say, well, there's 30 states with voter suppression laws aimed directly at the Black population, and we're still, it's just business as usual. We're going to pretend this hasn't happened? Because you talk about the 64 legislation. Well, there's stuff going on now that is an attempt to rescind all of that and take us back to what? I mean, at what point does this end? So sooner or later, corporate America has to say, where's our corporate headquarters? What are we signing off on here by being in, whatever the state is?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you answered that question. And I do think that corporations play a role. I mean, they hold the dollars, yes. They write the big checks, and they certainly influence what happens politically in the cities that they reside in and that they touch with their business. I was just sitting here thinking about the work that I did with our PAC at Pfizer, Political Action Committee. Most corporations, large corporations, have some sort of PAC where they'll ask you to donate a certain percentage of your direct deposit, but also being actively engaged with how your organization is lobbying for things, their stance on legislation like that. I certainly, though, believe, to your point, that companies play a role in that. And there's not this, back to trying to compartmentalize, it may not be in the out in the front, but certainly a business and politics is well connected. So they aren't separate. So I just always laugh when people are like, we don't talk about politics. I'm like, you're here working because of politics.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, politics isn't everything that you do. So let's not tell that lie, because it's not a white lie.
Let's not pretend, because the very words diversity, equity, and inclusion, in the big sense of the, let's assume some basic stuff, that it comes from legislation. That's because somebody got voted into office who voted a certain way. If we're writing new voter restriction laws everywhere to make sure that we never get forced to do anything like the 64 legislation again, and in fact, we're going to roll parts of it back. This seems to me that if there is such a thing as an enlightened corporate culture, if they're not addressing this, then what the hell use are they?
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
Oh, good. Okay. I mean, that gets right up to the "Thus saith the Lord" thing. And
it does. Hey, it's, I don't know, maybe number one.
I'm going to pray on this, and if you're not careful, I'm going to pray against you on this, and then watch out. My dad was a preacher.
Sorry.
So anyway, this has been a great pleasure. Do me a favor, and let's get this title of your book correct this time. And I don't want to read it again. Yeah, I want you to hold it up and say it properly.
Okay, the book is called Thrive Through It. If you search Thrive Through It, it's on Audible. So if you like to listen, it's on Audible. You can find it on Amazon as well, or on my website, BrittanyCole.com. Just my first. And
we're going to link everything we do is going to have your website up, and we'll have a link to the book. They can just push a button and get it on Amazon and listen to it. Do you have somebody else reading it, or is it you reading it?
I read it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, nice, because you have a great voice. I was hoping it was.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. What else can we do for you, Brittany, besides putting links to everything and let people follow up? And again, this is Frank Schaeffer in Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. If you like this conversation, please like it in the online sense as well. And get in touch with Brittany, but also buy the book and talk to her. So Brittany, is there something I've left out where you're saying, gee, I wish she had mentioned this?
I think we covered the gamut. The only thing that I would just say to wrap us up, if you are part of an organization that's looking to recruit and, more importantly, retain diverse talent, feel free to reach out to us at careerthrivers.com. That's Thrivers with an S on the end. I would be happy to chat with you, connect with you, and see how we can help to support you building a more inclusive culture.
Good. And Brittany, please feel free to share this interview when Ernie, my wonderful producer, posts it with anybody you want to have see this. And lastly, I would just say, we're always looking, our interviewing you is not a fluke. We interview a little more than half women every time. We're looking for all sorts of voices. Your issues of diversity, equity, inclusion is exactly where our head is at. We don't always know what to do about it, but if you have other people, some of these people that you're working with that you want to recommend, and you've got Ernie's contact, please say, have you thought about interviewing fill in the blank? And if you ever want to be back and be interviewed with a partner of yours or somebody you're working with and say, hey, maybe I can bring this woman that I work with on and we can do another interview on the subject that is of interest to her, please suggest titles, because we're so interested in talking about these issues, and we don't know enough to make all the right choices all the time. So the help you could give us would be great, and we would have you back on in a heartbeat.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Frank. This has been so fun. Of course, I'll definitely share it and appreciate you having me on your show.
Yeah. And just remember, anybody that you think we ought to be talking to, we will talk to.
Definitely. I have 2 women in mind right now.
Just tell them to Ernie and give us the contact, and we'll be there in a heartbeat. We'll be there in a heartbeat. And if we can ever do anything for you, or there's something you're doing that you want to share with people, just call Ernie and say, I'd like to be on again so I can talk about this new book or whatever it is you're doing.
Certainly. I will do it.
All right. Well, much love to you and your work, and blessings.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Take care. Bye now.